All right. All right, Jill, you just give me the go when you're ready.
I think we're ready.
Cool. All right, y'all. My name is Adam Fletcher Sasse, and I am here today to talk about the history of parks in North Omaha, the riveting topic of parks in North Omaha. I presume you all knew the topic, and that's why you came, because you're riveted along with me. I was joking earlier that I was really excited when I wrote the description for this presentation, because there are so many nuanced, small, tiny details about the parks that I only found out through my research and digging it all up. And I got really excited when I wrote the presentation description, but then when I put together the actual presentation over the last few days, it's not that they're not interesting anymore. It's just I think I've squeezed the stone quite a bit. So I'm going to share with you some of what I found when I squeezed that stone, and we're going to see how well you like it. Today, though, I will tell you that I want to open the floor more for conversation and questions and anything as we go along. So as we go, don't be afraid to stop and ask a question or wave your hand.
I'm going to stop and ask a question.
Exactly.
Can you take the box off of the screen that says this meeting is being recorded?
I don't know. No, you have to take that off. You have to hit OK.
Oh, jeez.
I tell you.
I want to do as little with the computer as possible. Oh,
is there okay on the remote?
She's got to just hit enter, I think.
You got it?
Yeah,
there you go.
All right. Good deal.
You techie, you.
All right, so this is a history of parks in North Omaha then. Before we get going, let's just do a quick test. Does anybody in the room recognize either one of these two pictures that's on this first slide? This is a bonus question just to get us going.
Miller Park and Fontdale.
On the close, you're definitely right on the black and white image. That's a picture from the very first week that the Miller Park pool was desegregated. In 1953, the Omaha Parks Commissioner said we have to let blacks in. And they did for the first time ever. You'll notice that in the distance, there's a man standing on that railing with a white lid on his head. That's a policeman.
Wow, really?
In Miller Park in 1953. So that's one way to start the conversation. Then here on the other side, the sepia-toned picture. I heard Fontdale Park. Say that again.
Benson Lagoon?
Close. Anybody else? All right, that's Kuntz Park.
Kuntz.
Yeah, Kuntz had its own lagoon after the Trans-Mississippi Expo. They were supposed to put in a royal lagoon that was going to cover the entire distance, remnant from the Expo's lagoon. But they didn't do it. They just had a little hole in the ground for about 50 years. And then for about 30 years. And then in the 1930s, well, I'll tell you the story later on. Well, that's just the teaser. Anyway, that's in Kuntz Park. So today we're going to talk about the parks in North Omaha. Now, as a reminder before we get going, remember that when I talk about North Omaha, I'm talking about everything from Dodge Street north to the Washington County line and everything from 72nd Street east to the river. So it's a giant swath of land. And I don't talk about North Omaha as a neighborhood. North Omaha is a community that's made up of dozens of neighborhoods. If you follow my work with North Omaha history, you'll know that I've tracked down at least 37 different historic neighborhoods. And guys, I know that I have dozens more to go, literally in North Omaha alone. So it's all very exciting for me and I love uncovering it. But this parks project, this is really doing the research on this has pushed my brain a little bit further because it's taking me further west. I haven't really concentrated in the last 10 years I've been doing this project. I haven't concentrated too much on anything west of 42nd Street. You know, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, anything west of 42nd Street was kind of, you know, it was no man's land. It was kind of fancy out there and whatever. And so looking at the parks in the entire community of North Omaha, I got to go all the way out to 72nd, and it's cool. You know, there's a lot more to learn. Someday I'll tell the true story of Fair Acres, and we'll see how they deal with it. And I'll include them in North Omaha. They'll like that. Some people get that joke. All right. So, but here's by the numbers. Let's look at parks in North Omaha. 1840, the date the first North Omaha Park was laid out, preceded the city by 14 years. 60 plus or minus 60 is the total number of community-wide parks all across North Omaha. 60. 2,000 is the total acres of parks. I dug through so much information to get that number, but added them all up, and that's what it came to. 70 play structures in all of North Omaha, just in the parks alone, and that's an estimate. 1,000 estimated miles of trails throughout the parks in North Omaha alone. 14 historic parks that go back 100 years or more. And then 6 historic pavilions, and we'll touch base on each of those as we go along. Now, these are my estimates only. They're not official. I didn't get them from the city of Omaha. And the information that I did get there, I had to do the math, so I wouldn't attribute it to being that great. But I'm also a product of Omaha Public Schools, so take it as you will. The math stuff.
Adam, what was the first North Omaha Park?
Dun, dun, dun. Come on now. I'm just baiting
Memorial?
you. I'm going to drag you along. Nope. Not Memorial Park. We'll
I
get
was
there.
just gonna hear that and then I could leave, so.
I know. I'll keep it. Well, then that's the case. That's going to be at the 55-minute mark. We'll reveal. No, I'm joking. We'll get there before then. I am a sucker for an audience, let me tell you. So here we go. The first park that I just want to throw out there is Fontenelle Park. And it's not because it's my favorite or anything like that, but it's interesting. And it has its own interesting history. I put 2 things right here, as well as these little factoids. The factoids are that the park was originally planned in 1892. Fontenelle Park was originally planned as part of a system of parks and boulevards in Omaha designed by a man named Horace Cleveland. Horace Cleveland was an East Coast landscape architect who was contracted by the city council to lay out the parks and boulevard system for the city. Omaha saw that Kansas City was putting in a parks and boulevard system. Omaha saw that Chicago had a parks and boulevard system. So Omaha wanted a parks and boulevard system. And Horace Cleveland came and laid it out. You are familiar with a lot of the places on it. And that was 1889 when they started talking to Cleveland, 1892 when he delivered his plan. And Fontenelle Park was one of the first parks that was laid out according to the plan. Now, keep in mind that when Fontenelle Park went in, there were literally no houses to the north of it. There were almost no houses to the west of it. So it took a long time for the park to develop, and it wasn't formally dedicated until 1914. You might be familiar with the pavilion there. That pavilion has had a dozen different lives. And some of them are super cool, and some of them are really interesting, and some of them a little bit mundane. But it's definitely been a center. It's been a hub for the entire community for 100 years now. The pavilion was built right when the park was dedicated. But interestingly, if you look in the photo on the, as you're sitting, it should be on your left, the black and white photo. You can see the pavilion right there in the center of the picture, the lagoon beyond it. But right in front of the pavilion, there's some grandstands. Look at the size of those grandstands. This photo was taken in 1921. By 1933, baseball was so huge at Fontenelle Park that they considered putting in a stadium for baseball at Fontenelle Park. In 1936, the plan went forward thanks to money from the Works Progress Administration. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But the plan was to build a gigantic stadium right there in Fontenelle Park. They were going to have a semi-pro baseball team play in it. They were going to host amateur games in it. It was going to be humongous, but they decided not to build it there. They got protests from the neighborhood around it, especially south of Paxton Boulevard and to the east all the way to north and to 30th Street. They didn't want that traffic to be at Fontenelle Park because they love their lagoon. They love the golf course. They love the different features and kind of that solitude of the park. So they didn't put a stadium in there. But of course, Omaha didn't give up on the stadium, and eventually it built Rosenblatt. Could you imagine a stadium the size of Rosenblatt right there in this photo? That was the plan. And I actually have blueprints of that original plan. It's a little bit mind-blowing. So if you want more information on that and see those blueprints, just check out NorthOmahaHistory.com. Now, let's just jump around a little bit. The oldest parks in North Omaha. Here you go. The very first park laid out in Omaha was actually Florence Park. Near and dear to our hearts. We all know it and love it because you drive by it all the time. Florence Park was laid out in 1840 as part of winter quarters by the Mormon pioneers. It was intended to be a town square and to act like a town square. But you'll notice another park at the top, North Market Square Park. You might not be familiar with that name unless you've been using the park in the last 10 years or so. The city changed its name. It used to be called Fillmore Park, and it's right next to the Florence Community Center and the library. Those two parks were part of the original layout of winter quarters by the Mormons, and then they were kept by the people who laid out Florence. And both of them are still parked today. So how do you like them beans? 180-year-old parks in North Omaha. We're going to get into Florence Park a little bit more in a minute, but it is interesting to me. Today, North Market Square has a baseball park there, a field that's in pretty rough condition, and then of course the library and the community center. Florence Park has a gazebo in the middle that's supposed to echo its historic gazebo. There's been a gazebo in Florence Park at least since the 1910s. Does anybody know the story of the Mormon tree in Florence Park? Now, some of you might have been alive back then, but all the way into the 1960s, I think it was 62 when they cut it down, there was a tree in the center of Florence Park. And this tree was said to have been planted by Brigham Young himself. And before Florence had a tourism industry or whatever you want to call it, dedicated to the Mormon pioneers, there were people who would come from across the country as part of their faith and learning about their Mormonism or Latter-day Saints Church and all this. They would come and look at the tree because they believed that Brigham Young had planted it. There's no evidence that he actually did, but it was part of that mythology. And that tree stood into the early 60s. And some people have it in their memory still. Jefferson Square Park. Now, I'm not going to go on too much about Jefferson Square Park because I will be talking about it in a future presentation. But does anybody remember Jefferson Square Park? All of my students of history? Oh, do I see a hand? Maybe?
No.
Okay, all right. Jefferson Square Park was the very first park laid out in the city of Omaha's plat map. When they first laid out the streets, a guy named Alfred Jones, he became a mayor. He was the mayor or the postman who walked around with a stovetop hat when the mail inside of it, right? And that was the story about Alfred Jones, is that he handed out the mail from his stovetop hat. But he also laid out the first map of Omaha, laid out the lots and the whole thing. He was contracted to do that by the ferry company. And he put in 3 parks on that map, and only one of them was developed, and that was Jefferson Square Park. And it was at 14th and Cass, way down there. But remember, in Adams' definition, it's anything north of Dodge, so that counts. The city obliterated Jefferson Square Park in 1969 to make way for I-480. And today, the location of the park butts right up to the interstate. And there's no sign that it was ever there. Some people might know that that park had a euphemism. It was called Bums Park. For decades, from the 1930s, 20s and 30s, all the way into the 60s. Bums Park, because of the homeless population there. The other old parks, the oldest parks in North Omaha are Bemis Park from 1889. You know that one, it's over on Cummings Street by Lincoln Boulevard and Hawthorne. Miller Park, we all know it and love it, from 1891, and Fontenelle Park from 1892. We're going to dive into Miller Park in a minute. But let's take a look at a couple more old pictures. Now, if anybody can recognize the one on the left of just the trees and that little dip in the land, you get bonus points. Nobody? Phew, that's Bemis Park. This is 1923 when this photo was taken. And And you could see that there was very little development there, just that little trail up the middle. At one point, there was a lagoon in that location, but it was drained out in the 1920s because it was yucky. People in the neighborhood didn't want it. On the right-hand side, does anybody recognize that pavilion?
Miller Benson? Benson?
That is Benson Park, yes. And that park was, or I'm sorry, that pavilion itself, the park is old. The pavilion was built in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration. So we're going to get into the legacy of the WPA and North Omaha's parks in just a minute. Ooh, how about right now? The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a program of the FDR administration in the Great Depression to put people to work. And one of the things that they did was employ men across the United States to build things, civic works mostly. And in Nebraska, the Works Progress Administration was the big federal agency that administered the CCC. The Works Progress Administration built more than 100 different things. So many, in fact, that it's hard to track all of them. So I've done a lot of digging to find out just the information that's here, which doesn't seem like very much, but let me tell you. One of the biggest stamps that the CCC left on North Omaha specifically was at Levi Carter Park. And you can see in this graphic that I made on the right-hand side, there were 20 buildings that used to exist in the northwest corner of Carter Lake Park. Those buildings are almost all gone. There's only one left today. And for a time, they hosted at least 500 men who were part of that CCC program. Those men built a whole bunch of things around Omaha and all over Nebraska. But in Omaha, especially in North Omaha, they were responsible for building the bathhouses that still exist today at Carter Lake Park. Those bathhouses are now called the Carter Lake Pavilion, and they got new roofs a decade ago. They're not in great condition. They're not really kept up by the city very well, but there's still neat old spaces that are right there from the 1930s. 1936 is when those were finished. There was a boathouse that was reconstructed on the west side of Carter Lake itself, off of the boulevard. And that boathouse has been rebuilt now, but it stood and was used for 50 years. The Benson Park Pavilion itself was built by the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And then there were improvements that were made at Hummel Park, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. At Kuntz Park, and that was primarily that lagoon that I showed early on. They lined the sides of it and made it safe for the kids to play in, and then they built a pavilion there that's actually gone now. It was replaced. But those improvements at Kuntz Park. And then I put Ames Avenue improvements here before the CCC came along in 1935. Ames Avenue was just a 2-lane road that went from Commercial Avenue all the way out to 42nd Street in the 1930s. And the CCC came in and they paved the south side of it to make it into a 4-lane and turn it into a major thoroughfare for the community. So I put that on here for the parks list because their pavement went all the way from Commercial Avenue all the way out to, actually their pavement started at about 26th. I got that wrong, but it went all the way out to Fontenelle Park. And so that really opened up Fontenelle Park for a lot of new realities. One of the realities of Fontenelle Park was an annual fireworks display that happened from 1919 all the way into the 1970s. So does anybody remember the Fontenelle Park fireworks on July 4th?
Yeah.
All right, finally, I got one. Phew. They were shot off from the island in the middle of the lagoon, and they were a highlight of a lot of people's lives. How big were those gatherings? Does anybody have a number off the top of their head, or can you imagine it?
Big. Huge.
I saw one newspaper article that talked about 75,000 people coming to Fontenelle Park to watch those fireworks at its peak. So that's something else. But that Ames Avenue went all the way there. All right, here's another test. In the upper left-hand corner, there's a trash barrel in the middle of that romantic picture. and a sidewalk. And here's a hint about that picture in the upper left-hand corner with that trash barrel. That's about all of the park that you're seeing right there, or that you will see in that park, is that same kind of view. A sidewalk, a trash barrel. Any guesses? All right, so that is called the oh, go ahead, say that again.
Adams Park? No.
Nope.
It's bigger now.
Not a bad guess though, because Adams isn't really well developed. Any other thoughts? All right, so this is Bluff View Park. Bluff View Park, it's along Florence Boulevard, just north of Ames. Can you guys envision where that is now? It's a weird little pocket park that doesn't have very many acres at all, but it's weird in a lot of ways. It was originally designated as a park. In my research, I found it designated in 1899. So it turns out, remember the big Trans-Mississippi Exposition? It turns out that they were supposed to leave more footprints in North Omaha than they did. There was actually a plan for a gigantic archway to cross over Florence Boulevard in Coons Park in order to commemorate what had happened. But they were also supposed to designate a new park over by 16th and Locust, which was the eastern side of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. They didn't do it. What they did instead was give a chunk of land along this bluff to the city. When that chunk of land was given to the city, it was a beautiful wide open view from Florence Boulevard to look down onto the Missouri River Valley. And it was something to look at because you had the kind of rural area that was down in where we think of East Omaha today in Carter Lake, but it also went all the way over to the Les Hills in Iowa. And the Les Hills, that view was just phenomenal. And there were no trees on this cliff and this bluff view part. So it was well intended, but then the city never did anything with it. Now they've managed to extend the boundaries of the park, so they actually go all the way from Ames, well, almost Ames, but they go all the way to Dead Man's Curve, to Carter Lake Boulevard, right there. And all of that land in the middle of Carter Lake Boulevard, in Dead Man's Curve, when you're going down the hill, all of that land is part of Bluffview Park now. And it's maintained by the City Parks and Rec in the name of that place. But the park is underdeveloped. What you see in that photo is grass, trees, and that trash barrel. To the right, you can just see the park signage peeking out. I covered it up. I obfuscated it. But I did that to just kind of give you that little challenge, but also to kind of, that's all the park is. There's no playground. There's no other walking paths beyond the sidewalk. There's not even really any parking. And then the weird part is that there are some house lots in the middle between Bluffview Park, as we think of it, along the boulevard, and Dead Man Curve. There's a couple of beautiful houses that are right there in the middle of the park. So, you know, there's that. I like to celebrate these places. I can't explain them very well sometimes. So one of the fun things that's happened, I have an article on NorthOmahaHistory.com called The History of Parks. And one of the fun things that's happened, I've actually had people who work for Parks and Rec call me to get more information because they don't know what I know about the park. That's an awkward thing, right? I want my city officials knowing about the places they're responsible for, but it's okay. This stuff gets lost to time. Like the postcard that's just below Bluffview Park. Can anybody read the caption on that one? Wince really closely and you'll see on the top it says Birch Drive, Miller Park, Omaha, Nebraska. Now I want you to hear in your ears, imagine in your ears the awooga of that horn on that car. Those trees that you see are birch trees, and there are still a few that are scattered into the park right now. Most of them have been replaced, but they were all planted in 1891 by a man named Dr. George Miller. Dr. Miller was the first physician, formally trained physician in Omaha. He got there right when the town was started in Omaha City when it was started in 1855. And then Miller went on to do a whole bunch of things. He developed a big mansion out in Ralston, but he also owned the land that became the Miller Park neighborhood, as well as the land that became Miller Park. He thought that the way to get people to buy into it would be to develop a pretty little park there. He got with that Horace Cleveland that I mentioned earlier, and he said, hey, make my land part of that design that you're doing. And he ended up selling his land pretty cheap to the city. But he did that after he planted more than 100 birch trees by hand in his park. So the birch trees in this photo, or I'm sorry, in this postcard from the early 1900s, those birch trees were all planted by Dr. Miller.
Is that why
And
the bike is called the Birchwood Club?
exactly. Now we can tie a whole bunch of knots together here really tightly, because before the Birchwood Club was called the Birchwood Club, it was called, anybody? It was called the Prettiest Mile in Omaha Club. That's what it was built as and opened as in 1916. The Prettiest Mile in Omaha Club. And the prettiest mile in Omaha was Florence Boulevard. To take that drive from Ames Avenue all the way up to Miller Park, remember that the boulevard actually curves and turns into Miller Park before it dead ends. There used to be a drive right there on the east side of Miller Park at Florence Boulevard, and that drive went right into the park, and it circled all the way around Miller Park on both sides of the pond. On the north side, people could get off and go to the Prettiest Mile in Omaha Club. It only became the Birchwood Club when it changed hands in the 1930s, and then changed its facade, of course, in the 1940s. The first facade for the Prettiest Mile in Omaha Club was Spanish Colonial Revival, and it was this beautiful stucco and curved edges. And there's a house along Middleusa Boulevard right now that still has that same look, dating from 1916. So beautiful stuff, but all part of the same system. The Miller Park, the Prettiest Mile in Omaha, the Prettiest Mile in Omaha Club, it's all tied together. So we look at the middle of this photo, and now this shot, in the middle of this slide, this shot is a black and white slide. And again, we get that awooga, but this car is a little bit older than the one in the Miller Park postcard. This is from the 1920s. Is any guesses on where this wild place is?
Hummel Park.
Bonus, good job. So this is River Drive. It used to be called, now we just refer to it as part of J.J. Pershing Drive. But this is going around the corner leading up to Hummel Park there on the right where the cliff is, and on the left, Dodge Park. Those parks were originally brought into the city's fold in the 1930s. The parks commissioner was named Joseph Hummel, and they named Hummel Park after him. Dodge Park was, of course, named for NP Dodge, but we don't call it NP Dodge Park because apparently Council Bluffs has its own. So we just call it Dodge Park. And yeah, in the upper right-hand corner, I already mentioned this one. Anybody got a beat on what that park is, where the baseball diamond's showing?
North Market. North Market.
Yeah, that's North Market Square in Florence. And then behind it right there. Say it again.
MUD.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Bonus points. So remember the fun thing, and if you can imagine this, the reason why it was called North Market Square, the intention was that is where business was done. The Latter-day Saints had real strong opinions about when and where that business would occur, and you could pull your wagon in there on the weekends and sell your bounty, whatever it was. And they actually had two market squares. North Market Square was right here on Bondison, and then South Market Square was down almost all the way to Weber. So they really had a vision for the size of that town when they laid it out. But there you go, still standing. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, does anybody recognize that view? Does anybody know what this view is? Say it again.
Is it Miller Park? The
No.
water thing?
They look similar. This one, yeah, so this one is Gallagher Park in Benson. And these splash pads are the latest, newest, and greatest. And some people get really interesting, when you talk about them removing the swimming pools to put in splash pads, some people get really offended. They feel some personal feeling about the pool. What I know is that kids play in these splash pads and they have fun. And that's the whole point of the park. It might not be for me, who I want that good old pool. And I didn't like the pool in the first place. But the point is the splash park is good times and kids are having fun there. So yeah, there's a little bit more. Let's take a look at this one. Now, Adams Park is easy to focus on just because of its size. This park is almost 200 acres, or just over 200 acres. And it's located down on 30th Street at Bedford, just off of the John A. Creighton Boulevard. It's interesting because the John A. Creighton Boulevard was laid out in the 1910s, and it cut through, you can see in the top photo right there, it cut through this big swath of open land. Originally, that open land was actually in the 1870s, it was a vineyard, a grape vineyard that was planted by this wealthy dude who had a big house down on 30th Street. Interestingly enough, his 1870s house is down on 30th Street still today. And it had its own interesting life. But his farm eventually became Adams Park in 1960. It took that long for the city to make it into something because it wasn't developing otherwise. They didn't sit on it on purpose. It didn't develop. Then finally the city took interest and put in the park. One of the reasons why they slept on this area for so long, on the right-hand side in the 2020 photo on the bottom, you can see that forest right there. That forest is actually outside of the parameters of the park. You look to the photo above that in 1930, and you can see that same area still has some forests in it, and then a few spotty pieces of land. Guys, that area was called Plum Nelly, and it was an African-American community that was made up of very, shall we say, put together housing, not formal houses. A few little bungalows, a little shotgun shack, but mostly they were shacks that were for low income people. And it was Black, and the city did not want to serve that neighborhood. But by 1960, there was enough of a movement, enough support to build up Adams Park. But Adams Park to this day still hasn't been fully developed because the city hasn't really shown the amount of interest that they could have. That's changed in just the last 2 years. And there is actually a master plan now for the further development of the park that they're moving on. So that'll be interesting to see where it goes. But I'll say two things. First is that the park neighbors the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation, which has its own development there to the north off Bedford Avenue. It has its own development that's like a park, and it's a beautiful place. If you haven't been to Malcolm X lately or ever, go check it out. It's fun as a historical visit, and you can really see some neat things. The house where Malcolm X was born is just to the north, or the location of that house is just to the north, and that's where the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation is today. That house was part of Plum Nelly that I had explained. And then the other thing that I'll point out about this park, a little unique anomaly, is this Bedford Avenue pumping station. I'm a nerd. I know I've told you this before. If you've been in these sessions, you've heard it. If you've seen anything I've ever written, you've seen it. But the fact of the matter is, I like buildings and I like architecture. I'm not an architect. I don't play one on TV. I'm also not an artist. Now, you know, we could take the loose definition, and I like to draw. I like to color. So on the left is my photo of the Bedford Avenue pumping station. This is just an MUD building. It's not, you know, some big romantic thing, but look how neat that is. Look at all the features on it. And then to the right is Adam's interpretation of it. You know, it's kind of the energy of the building. So I think it's important to laugh at ourselves every now and then, and I'm an easy target for myself. So I like to have fun with that. But yeah, I do think the building is super neat, and I don't know that it'll ever be public. I don't know that it'll ever be something that we can go into and enjoy, but it is part of Adams Park. It sits right in there and is nestled in and largely forgotten. And you can drive by it and never notice it. Lots of people have driven by it and never noticed it. I like to take a look at it every time I come to town. I'm just that way. And it's really hard to draw Spanish tile. I'm just not patient enough to get the details. But anyway. And then, of course, my favorite part. Now, I say it's my favorite. I grew up at 27th and Ellison, and this is where I went to scrape the edges of the pond with a rake in order to get crawdads, to throw in a bucket, take them back home 4 or 5 blocks, and then dig a hole in the ground, dump them in the ground, and pretend like they were going to stay there. And every single time, 5 or 6 times, every single time they'd be gone the next morning because some raccoon or cat or dog or something had a great meal that night, right? But Miller Park, for all of its goodness, badness, misgivings, opportunities, futures, past, had a lot of history. And I'm gonna chip you off at least one thing that you might not have known, and it involves this postcard that you see right here. But let's go down the list. 1854, Miller Park was bought by a man named James M. Parker. If anybody's familiar with the Bank of Florence, you know Parker's name as well as the other wild cats that were involved with it. But Parker didn't leave Florence after it folded. You know, Bank of Florence folded in 1857. There was a big national financial panic, and the Bank of Florence closed down. But then it opened back up. It didn't shut down permanently, and it stayed open in one form or another all the way until 2013. And what are you talking about, Adam? That Bank of Florence is closed for a long time. Sure it was, but you all remember down on 30th and Ames, 33rd and Ames, the North Side Bank. Yeah, that was the Bank of Florence. Same institution, different name. So James M. Parker was a founding banker with that bank. He bought the land that became Miller Park to have a corn farm. He expanded his land in the next 30 years after that to the north. If you live in Minnelusa, you live on James Parker's farm. If you live in Florence Field, you live on James Parker's pond. Anyway, he owned land all the way up to what we know today as Fontenelle Boulevard, and all the way down to J.J. Pershing Drive. The man owned land, like he had a lot of it. And he actually, in the 1880s, sold it to Dr. George Miller. Well, he didn't. He was dead by then. Actually, he moved away. But his son sold it to Dr. Miller. And Miller bought it, invested in it, and then eventually planted his trees. And then he sold his neighborhood. Oh, before he started selling his neighborhood as the Miller Park neighborhood, he tried to land the Trans-Mississippi Expo at the park. Of course, the Expo was in 1890, but he tried in 1896 and they turned him down. So the Trans-Mississippi Expo almost ended up at Miller Park, but didn't. Instead, they gave him a little consolation prize in 1899, and they brought 2 steel bridges. If you've ever seen pictures of the Trans-Mississippi Expo, you'll know that there were 2 steel bridges that crossed the lagoon in the middle of the expo. And it was a huge lagoon. It went on for 6 blocks. And right in the middle of it on Florence Boulevard were 2 steel bridges, one that crossed to an island and another one that crossed away from the island. They took those bridges from the expo and they brought them up to Miller Park. And once upon a time, there was one on the north end of the park by the Prettiest Mile Club. And there was one on the south end of the pond, as we think of it today, where Birch Drive is. But Adam, where did they go? Well, that's another story. But first, let me finish saying this. Those 2 steel bridges were put in over a creek. Some people call that creek Fort Omaha Creek. Some maps refer to it as Minnelusa Creek. I've written a history of it. So if you want to look up more, just check out NorthOmahaHistory.com and Google Minnelusa Creek. And you will discover that a creek used to flow from 36th and Sorensen Parkway all the way down 4th Street, all the way up 27th, all the way through Miller Park, all the way up Minnelusa Boulevard, all the way to, oh, wait a second, Stink Creek. You know, that little unpaved area that's just south of OPPD. That was Minnelusa Creek. And it was originally a natural creek that flowed all the way from 36th and Sorensen Parkway, all the way down through Miller Park. So the problem became that, the houses in Minnelusa started getting developed in 1916, and they did not have a sewer system. So everybody would throw their stuff out on the street, and it would form a little gully, and it would travel down to the creek. And all of the outhouses that were in all of those early houses in 1916 flowed in the ground down the hills on Ida and Mary and all those other streets into Minnelusa Creek. And Minnelusa Creek, in the middle of Minnelusa Boulevard as we think of it today, Minnelusa Creek, the entirety of it became known as Stink Creek. And nobody wanted to walk through the thing in the middle of Miller Park. Hey, let's put these old bridges down there. So they covered it up with the bridges. And then in the 1920s and the early 20s, they built a sewer. And that sewer went all the way underneath Minnelusa Boulevard up to Stink Creek, as we know it today, there at J.J. Pershing Drive. in Miller Park, they dammed up that creek and they formed a gigantic pond. And when people say, well, the pond at Miller Park is fed by an artesian well, not quite. The pond at Miller Park is, right? The pond at Miller Park is fed by a undergrounded creek. That creek is still there. It's channeled through the sewers now, and we'll never see it again, probably. But, you know, there's places like progressive Lincoln, Nebraska, that is, they have a term for it, and I'm not going to remember what it is, daylighting. They daylighted a big creek in Lincoln, Antelope Creek, and it's beautiful. Maybe we could daylight Metalusa Creek, open up the boulevard and let that creek flow openly. Anyway, Miller Park right there. Oh yeah, the golf course came around 1920s, loved for a long time. 1950, the swimming pool opened, and in 2007, that splash pad was put in. And of course, the other things, Carriero's Oak Park, the play fields, the ball fields, the beautiful trails through Miller Park now that Nancy writes about inside of the Omaha World Herald, and just all of the pretty things that make Miller Park so great. But now we have this place. Wait a second. These aren't random photos. These are photos all of the same place. And I gave it away in the first picture. From 1950 to 1960, there was a place in Carter Lake, in the park, in Levi Carter Park, that was called Kitty Land and Pleasure Pier. Does anybody remember Kitty Land? All right, good. So Kitty Land was opened by a private operator. The city opened up Levi Carter Park to a private operator to put in an amusement park. And it was down at those, the Carter Lake Pavilion, it's called now, but it were actually bathhouses for the municipal beach that used to be at Levi Carter Park. And those bathhouses in 1950 became the home of Kittyland and Pleasure Pier. Kittyland was where all the kid rides were, and it was a full-on amusement park. It had this thing and that thing and all the other things that you expect from an amusement park for little kids, including the small train, including the teacups, they had steamboat rides out onto the lake. They had all kinds of performances and demonstrations. Pleasure Pier was the partner to Kittyland. You drop your kids off at Kittyland, then you go over to Pleasure Pier, which was actually, you know, that part of Carter Lake Park, the Levi Carter Park that juts out into the lake. It's a nice long little isthmus that sticks out into the lake. Yeah, lots of heads bobbing there. Well, I'll pretend. That was actually an adult amusement area that had picnics. It had a grill and a bar. They served alcohol. And so the parents would get toasted over at Pleasure Pier. The kids would be playing at Kittyland. And they'd all hop in the car together and drive back to North Omaha. But it was 1950s, you know, and that's apparently what people did. Now, other things that happened at Carter Lake, at Levi Carter Park. Now, when I'm saying Carter Lake here, I'm talking about the Omaha side. I'm not talking about the Iowa side at all, and I'm avoiding that altogether. So any photos you see here are from the Omaha side. So on the bottom left, you see that group of people looking at that boat. That's actually from the late 70s. Boating, of course, has always been big down at Carter Lake from Levi Carter Park, including boat races and all kinds of stuff. Rowing clubs met in the boathouse, which is in the upper right-hand corner, as well as sailing groups and different watercraft people. And kids also swam out of the boathouse for years. There were fishing docks down at Carter Lake out of Levi Carter Park. That's what we see in the center photo, is the man and his dog walking after fishing. And those were there all the way into the late 70s and early 80s. And in the bottom right corner, this photo is actually from the late 1910s. And you can see the early bathhouses that were there that were made out of wood. But look how packed that beach was. That was called the Omaha Municipal Beach. And it was developed by the city of Omaha to give everybody a place to go and hang out on the beach in Carter Lake before, you know, the airport started dumping oil on the ground or whatever happened. Yeah, it was a heck of a place and everybody loved it. Then we had other places that were important throughout North Omaha. The Kellum Pool was dedicated in 1952. It was located on Paul Street at 24th. It was located right next to the Logan Fontenelle projects. The pool was built specifically to keep black swimmers from other pools. There was this problem where, quote, problem, where African Americans wanted more access to the rest of Omaha beyond the near north side. And as white people, we just weren't really hep on that. And when African Americans started talking about going to Miller Park Pool, oh no, we didn't want that. So the city actually built a separate pool in the middle of the black neighborhood to keep black people in that neighborhood. When African Americans got to Miller Park and were admitted in with integration, white people from the Miller Park neighborhood and from Minnelusa neighborhood and from other neighborhoods actually built a private pool called High Point. And I have an article on the history of High Point that's a private pool. Yeah, swimming. That said, Kellum Pool was super popular for about 20 years. And then in the early 90s, it became unfun to go there. And by 1998, it was demolished and the city had taken it out, not replaced it. And today there's a parking lot where that pool used to be. But it was super important for a while. Bonus points to anybody who knows what the building behind that flat building is. That flat building was the Kellum Community Center that was owned by the city of Omaha. Then it became that building actually became part of Kellum School. Hint, hint. What's the big brown building, the big brown brick building behind the light buff building?
Kellum School.
Kellum School. That was the 1890 Kellum School that was down at 24th and Paul. Completely replaced in the 1950s as well. Now back to Levi Carter Park, because, you know, swimming. Levi Carter Park was started with a $1 million donation in 1908. That donation came from a woman named Selina Carter Cornish in memory of her first husband, whose name was Levi Carter. Now, Levi Carter was an industrialist. He ran a big factory in East Omaha, down south of the airport. And that factory was called the Carter White Lead Paint Company. Carter actually, he lived in Omaha, but he had factories in Chicago and ended up moving up there and expanded his paint empire. And at one time, at the beginning of the 20th century, he was a mogul who controlled the interior paint and exterior paint production for the United States when it was all white lead. I don't know if you guys remember the EPA stuff and the Superfund site for North Omaha, but it's partly his doing. All that lead. But he died. He died in 1903. He was 73 years old, and he had married a woman who was 20 years his junior. And he left her very wealthy. She ended up marrying his former lawyer, whose name was Edward Joel Cornish. Now, Cornish, of course, came from a wealthy family. You might be familiar with his little house down there and just south of downtown on 10th Street, the Cornish Mansion. If you're not, you want to look at it. It's beautiful. But it's still standing and very lovingly restored recently. Just something to look at. But Joel Cornish, Edward Joel Cornish, Ed Cornish, he became the president of the Omaha Parks Board, Parks Commission. And he was the one who secured the donation from his new wife. A little interesting bow there. She donated 246 acres of land all along the north side of Carter Lake. Carter Lake has a long history that goes all the way back to 1877. So this is really just 20 years, 30 years after Carter Lake was formed. Before that was part of the Missouri River. Originally 246 acres. Today it's 523 acres. So they've expanded it a lot. And the CCC was involved in that expansion as well. Part of the land that was Carter Lake originally in the 1920s became a little joint that today we call the Epley Airfield. So the park has grown and shrunk simultaneously. But they had big visions back in the day, and I wanted to make sure that I got this slide in here. This is a 1918 conceptual drawing for the bathhouse that they wanted to build at Carter Lake. Look at that. See the magnitude of that? St. Louis has an enormous bathhouse. It's this size from this era. But look in the background and you'll see those two flying planes from 1918. They started using the land at Carter Lake, what was Levi Carter Park, to the east of Carter Lake. They started using that in the 1910s to land airplanes in and out of. They also used another chunk of land at the end of North 16th as well for airplanes. So it's all very interesting stuff, but that beautiful bathhouse was never built. Instead, the WPA built a pretty one in the 1930s. And of course, that's still standing. Now, I'd be remiss after all this park stuff if I didn't mention that Omaha's grand park plan that was developed in 1892 wasn't just about parks. It was also about boulevards. In 1892, Horace Cleveland's park plan was part of the Garden Beautiful movement. It was a whole design movement across the United States that was focused on getting people out of their, I want to say stagnant indoor areas and getting them into the outdoors. The idea was that people needed to breathe fresh air. Pretty radical idea for then. It's radical right now. But they put in all of these parks and connected them all with park-like drives. So this map I got from another source. There are people in Omaha who work on these boulevard advocacy, and they do this work pretty exclusively. Omaha by Design is one organization that does it, but they advocate for these boulevards. Is anybody in the room familiar with the boulevard system? Have you driven it lately or seen it?
No.
Wave a hand. Yes. All right, good. That counts. The park system, you can go and drive this right now. I try to do this every time I come to Omaha. For those of you who don't know, I'm in Portland, or just outside of Portland, Oregon right now. And Portland does not have a system like this. Most cities in the United States don't have one. And if they did, it's gone now. But the long and short of it is, this dark blue line that you see on this map designates the city's boulevards. And you can see how they all connect the parks. You look there all the way downtown, and you'll see Cass Street on the bottom of that #1 line, and that's Florence Boulevard. It starts at Cass Street, and it goes all the way up to Coots Park, all the way up to Bluff View Park. You can go over on Carter Boulevard to Carter Lake Park, and then Carter Lake Boulevard goes around that park. You can continue north on Florence Boulevard, #3 and 4. 4 used to connect right into Miller Park, and you can't do that anymore, but you can swing around the end of Florence Boulevard, go down Minnelusa, hop through the park, and then zigzag up Belvedere Boulevard. Or you can go over to Martin and connect up to Fontenelle Boulevard, that #1 that's by Sorensen Parkway, swing down to Fontenelle Park. Then you have options. You can take Paxton Boulevard, John A. Creighton Boulevard into Adams Park, or you can go down Fontenelle Boulevard and connect back into Happy Hollow and the different points down in Benson, all those exotic places. The point is that this boulevard system was an intimate part of the park system in Omaha. So the next time that you're driving up Florence Boulevard, take a look around and imagine where all the flower beds were, because they were there. That's why it was called the most beautiful mile in Omaha Boulevard. And it led to more flowers and trees in Miller Park. And some of those flower beds are still spread across the boulevard system all throughout. But North Omaha was the home of the best of the boulevards. The whole intention was to have a smooth drive that didn't go over railroad tracks, and where you didn't have to stop at as many stoplights as you did on regular streets. And if you think about it, that is kind of still how it is. They're just in really cruddy shape. The city doesn't pave them as well as they could, and they don't have all the signage that they need to, but beautiful places. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the city's community centers. Now, these are just mentions because I'm going to do more on this later, but these are the ones that I could track in my research in the last couple of days. The Sorensen Community Center at 48th and Cass, the Adams Community Center in Adams Park, the Benson Community Center in the old Benson City Hall and Fire Station that's shown here in the picture. The Florence Community Center, like we said, up by the old Fillmore Park, North Market Square Park. The Sherman Community Center down on 16th Street, which is still closed after the pandemic, by the way. But you really get the sense that these community centers, they're part of this park system. Now, let's summarize. Let's hit some more facts to wrap this up. The oldest park in Omaha, laid out in 1840. There are approximately 60 total neighborhood-wide parks. I just repeat what I said in the beginning. You see each one of these blue dots, so I tried to map out the parks. North Omaha parks have more than 60 play structures. I love that. I love that number and that image of kids. One of the parks that I found in my research is called the Forest Lawn Park. I immediately thought that would be butted up against Forest Lawn Cemetery, but it turns out that it's actually on Forest Lawn Avenue. Is anybody familiar with it?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Good, good. So it's just a little triangle that sits right there, and it's got its own play structure. I think that's so important for kids to be able to appreciate these parks.
My parents live, Adam and Jill, my parents live just 2 houses from that little park.
Here, here.
And when we were kids, my brother convinced me that my parents owned the park.
Perfect. Good.
And so I would go down there and I would tell people they needed to leave because this was my parents' park. It's built for us.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love that image. And you know what's funny? I mean, just in general, they're all one of the things that I talk about, and I'm finishing up a new article that details all these parks. But one of the things that I talk about are pocket parks. North Omaha has a lot of pocket parks, and I would definitely call that Forest Lawn Park a pocket park. There's another one called Graham Park. Has anybody ever heard of Graham Park? Yeah, it's the weirdest thing ever. It's just off of Martin Avenue, just west of 30th Street. But if you don't know where it is, you're going to drive past it. It's a triangle.
Behind the gas station?
Exactly. Right behind the gas station. That is a City of Omaha park called Graham Park.
Wow.
There are more than 1,000 miles of trails in North Omaha, 14 historic parks. All right. So if you're hankering for more information about the parks and the history of the parks, I've only done 3 podcasts about them, but you can find them on NorthOmahaHistory.com. I got one on Fontenelle Park, one on Hummel Park, and I only have 2 podcasts about the parks in North Omaha. One's on Fontenelle Park. I liked it so much I made 2 graphics for it, and Hummel Park. So those are waiting for you. And then I explained some more of the parks' histories, the individual parks inside of my books, North Omaha History Volumes 1, 2, and 3. And then, of course, the website is packed with information. This is a recorded presentation, and I will make it available online, and I'll share that with Jill. Does anybody have any more questions or any questions of any kind related to the history of parks in North Omaha? Riveting, I know.
You know when the boulevard system was put in place?
Yep. So the boulevard system is part of Horace Cleveland's original 1892 parks plan. This landscape architect drew the map, and he said, here's where we're going to put a major park, and here's where we're going to put a major park, and we're going to lace them all together with these beautiful boulevards. The Minnelusa Boulevard is a little bit different because it wasn't laid out until the neighborhood was in 1916. But it's definitely part of that system today.
Adam, when I was a kid, my grandparents lived up about, I think, 36th or 38th in Hamilton. There was a water shed thing there, but it had a fountain there. Is that considered a park, or is that just part of like the water?
Yep.
For UD and
So that's called the Walnut Hill Reservoir. And for 100 years, the Walnut Hill Reservoir cranked out water for MUD in 3 gigantic pools at the very top of the hill right there. They built ornate stonework all around it. They had big columns, and they had pagodas and stairways. Lots of that's been taken out now. They put a roof over the entire thing. They fenced it off after 9/11. And at one point, though, it was a lover's lane up at the top, and it was lighted. And you would take your lady down there and woo her and the whole thing. And that park, that part that you remember, the staircase coming down.
It had that fountain there in the
fountain. Yeah, the huge fountain. The first colored lights, like rainbow colored lights ever bought by the city of Omaha, were put into that fountain in the 1950s. And kids would go down there and play in the water and have a grand time. That is actually that entirety of land for the Walnut Hill Reservoir is all property of MUD, all the way down to 36th and Lafayette right there. And there are actually plans to rip out the reservoir and develop that corner at 40th and Hamilton. So that's not happening fast. I mean, they've been talking about it for 6 or 7 years. So we'll see when it happens, but the fountain is still there right now, and it's kept up. The fountain actually runs in the summertime still, but kids don't play in it anymore. It's just not a thing.
Yeah, because the last time I was around there, they had gates or like a iron fence tall thing and stuff, but I didn't know it was Lover's Lane, but of course I was in bed by probably dark. Always in the house, but that's interesting, you know?
Yeah, the wooing that happens.
Yeah, because
Any
my
other
parents,
questions?
my grandparents just lived like 6 or 7 houses down that 2-lane. I don't know if it's streets, you know, because they had islands in between.
Yep,
And that
Hawthorne Street right there. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and that's all Bemis Park, the Bemis Park Historical District. It's called its formal name is the Bemis Park Landmark Heritage District, and it's actually the first protected neighborhood in all of Omaha. Was Bemis Park. Of course, the Minaloosa Historic District today is the largest in the city, but let's not brag. But the point is that beautiful park was it is part of MUD. Interesting note: the city of Omaha leases another park from MUD though, and it looks like and acts like a regular city park. Anybody have any guesses of where that is? Okay, it's called Craig. Go ahead.
I'm thinking too far west, because I'm thinking 108th and
Craig
Rolando.
28. Craig Park, right down here.
Right down here.
Craig Park.
Exactly. Craig's Park. And Craig's Park got a play structure. It's got a baseball field, it has good parking, but it is actually owned by MUD and leased by the city of Omaha. It's a really interesting dynamic. So hey, let's lease the Walnut Hill Reservoir Park and make that part of the city as well. Because that would be great to have more play structures in that area to boot.
Right. Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Any other questions?
I have one. You know, when you're down on the river road and there's like these stone steps that walk down to like the bike trail, was that ever developed more?
So I love that question. That's one of my favorite spaces. The bike trail is a really interesting thing. It's of course it's owned by the Papio Creek.
NRD.
Yes, NRD, the Natural Resource District. And it was installed along the water's edge just in the last 20 years. Before that, it was technically illegal, to be on the levee along the river and to be in that area down at the bottom of that hill. MUD originally installed those stairs when they built, so at one point, again, all back in the good old days, the MUD the Minaloosa pumping station was this grand structure that was in the Florence Water Works that was built in the 1890s to actually house the machines that cleaned the water. But they needed stairs to get down to the water's edge to do testing of the river right there. Just north of those stairs that you know of, just north of that is actually the intake station for the Minaloosa pumping station. And that intake station is also from the 1890s. They needed a way to get from up at the Minaloosa pumping station down to the river to test the water over to the intake station. And so all of that was part of that. Now, what's interesting about down there is that that's a roadway. And when you're down there on the trail, it feels still like a roadway. It's the right width. That's because in 1918, the city of Omaha was invested in a plan to build River Drive all the way from South Omaha, from the Bellevue city line, all the way up to Washington County line. And they had done test samples all along the way, including downtown, up at Dodge Park, down at the Florence Waterworks. And they had carved out those areas. And there are actually photos of cars and photos of machinery doing the digging where those stairs are just off of J.J. Pershing Drive, River Drive. And so originally that River Drive was going to go down where that trail is and then back up. And it just didn't happen that way. But definitely a mysterious and fun space. Almost as good as that question. It's almost as good as the 100 stairs in Hummel Park. They keep changing. Is there 100 or is there 96 or is there 107? Because they keep changing. And where does that staircase go? It just goes, it descends into the depth.
It goes to the albino farm.
Exactly. Exactly. Now we know. All right, we're all speaking the same language. So, fun. Any other questions, comments, anything? Y'all, I want to thank you for your time. This was fun. Our next presentation is going to happen in a couple months. Pay attention for all the announcements of it. Jill, do you remember the topic for the next one? Oh, actually, our next, oh, wait. Our next presentation, here's a top secret announcement that's just for you all. It's not formal yet. We haven't quite figured it all yet out. Jill, do you remember the date? February
25th.
February 25th. I am going to be in Omaha, Nebraska at Mount Olive doing a presentation in person.
Yay.
I'm going to sneak in like a ninja and it's going to be fun. I'm going to try to find a topic that is just riveting, you know, as all of them are. I think I've done streets and parks, and I just choose the juiciest stuff. If you have any thoughts or any ideas about what you want to hear about specifically, let me know. Let Jill know. She'll send me an email. You could send me an email, info@northomahistory.com. I'm always looking for great ideas, but I really want to come up with a Windinger for that February date, and let's have some fun. And I'll get to meet you in human being persons. So it'll be good times. Thank you all so much. This is a good one.
Thank you.
All right, bye guys.
Think about it,